In the fall of 1991, every grain elevator in Calhoun County, Iowa ran the same dryer. This was not a policy. It was not a recommendation from the Extension Office or a mandate from the co-op. It was simply the way things had settled, the way sediment settles at the bottom of a slow river. GSI tower dryers, 36-foot units with propane burners and paddle wheel loggers, serviced out of a dealership on Route 20 called Midland Ag Systems. That was what you bought when your old dryer gave out. That was what your neighbor bought. That was what the man at the co-op assumed you had when he asked about your moisture numbers. Not because anyone had compared the alternatives, but because Midland Ag Systems was there, and Terry Voss was behind the counter, and Terry Voss had a way of making you feel that asking questions was the same as wasting his time. Let me tell you about Norma Jean Schaefer, because you need to understand what she knew before you can understand what she did with 12 years in a machine shed full of other people's mistakes. Norma Jean was 52 years old in 1991. And had farmed the same 800 acres outside of Rockwell City with her husband Cal for 24 years. Cal had grown up on that ground. His father, Eldon, had broken it originally in the 1940s, pulling stumps along the creek bottom with a borrowed D4 and building the machine shed that still stood behind the house with lumber milled from the cottonwoods he'd cleared. Eldon had been a careful man. He had kept records on every piece of equipment he owned in a green ledger book he bought at the hardware store in town, and when he died in 1979, he left Cal that ledger along with the land and the equipment and a reputation for knowing things slowly and deeply, rather than quickly and loudly. Cal had the same habits. Norma Jean had married into them. She had grown up in Sioux Falls, the daughter of an electrician who moonlighted repairing industrial motors for the meatpacking plants on the east side of town. Her father, Bernard Kowalczyk, had a bench in the basement of their house on Cliff Avenue where he brought motors home on Friday evenings and returned them Monday mornings repaired and tested and billed at a rate that the plant foreman considered reasonable and that Bernard considered fair. She had stood beside that bench from the time she was 9 years old, handing her father tools when he asked for them, and not touching anything when he didn't. And she had learned things she did not know she was learning. She learned that a burned motor winding has a specific smell that stays in the insulation even after the motor cools. She learned that bearing wear announces itself in sound long before it announces itself in failure. She learned that the difference between a motor that will run another 5 years and a motor that will fail next season is visible to someone who knows where to look and invisible to everyone else. She had studied agricultural engineering for 2 years at South Dakota State before she met Cal at a county fair in 1967 and decided that farming was more interesting than finishing a degree. She did not regret this. She had continued learning, just not in a classroom. By 1991, the Schaefer farm ran a grain operation that moved somewhere between 60,000 and 80,000 bushels of corn and soybeans through the drying system in a good harvest year. Cal managed the field operations. Norma Jean managed everything that had an electrical panel on it. She was the one who read the equipment manuals. She was the one who called the manufacturers when something didn't match what the manual said. She was the one who kept the service records in a gray steel filing cabinet in the corner of the machine shed, one folder per piece of equipment. Going back to 1968 when she and Cal had bought their first combine together and she had started the filing system that first winter because she couldn't stand not knowing the history of something she was depending on. Their grain dryer was not a GSI unit. It was a Matthews Company tower dryer, a continuous flow design that Matthews had been building in Danville, Illinois since 1962. Cal's father Eldon had bought it in 1971 for reasons he had written down in his green ledger. Matthews uses a recirculating heat exchanger that recovers 30% of burner exhaust heat. GSI does not. Over the life of the machine, the fuel savings will pay for the price difference twice. Eldon had run the numbers in pencil in the margin. He had been correct. Norma Jean had maintained that dryer herself for 20 years, with a service manual and her father's basement education, and a telephone relationship with a Matthews parts distributor in Des Moines named Harold Finney, who had been selling her bearings and burner components and auger flights since 1974, and who considered her one of the 3 customers in the state who actually understood what they were ordering. Terry Voss had never sold her anything. Let me tell you about what Terry Voss did with grain dryers that came off lease or came back from failed operations, because that is where this story really begins. Midland Ag Systems had a lot behind the main building, a gravel rectangle surrounded by a chain-link fence with a sliding gate on a rusted track, and in that lot Terry Voss stored the equipment that didn't have anywhere else to go: lease returns, trade-ins taken at values that didn't justify resale, units pulled from farms that had gone under in the debt consolidations of the mid-1980s, when a third of the operations in Calhoun County changed hands or disappeared entirely. By 1988, there were 11 grain dryers in that lot in various states of completeness. By 1991, there were 19. By 1994, there were somewhere between 25 and 30, depending on whether you counted the units that had been partially cannibalized for parts and the burner assemblies that had been removed and stacked separately under a tarpaulin that had not been replaced since Reagan was in office. Terry Voss was not saving them for any purpose he had worked out. He was not saving them at all in the intentional sense. He was simply not throwing them away, which is a different thing, though. From the outside it can look the same. Norma Jean had driven past that lot for years without stopping. She knew it was there. She knew roughly what was in it. She was not a woman who spent time wanting things she hadn't decided to pursue. In September of 1993, the Matthews distributor in Des Moines, Harold Finney, called her on a Tuesday morning to tell her that Matthews Company had been acquired by a larger agricultural equipment manufacturer and that the new ownership had made the decision to discontinue the Matthews dryer line. Parts would be available through existing distributor inventory for an estimated 2 to 3 more years, Harold told her, and after that, she would be on her own. Harold sounded like a man delivering a diagnosis he wished he didn't have to give. He had been selling her parts for 19 years. He was retiring at the end of the year anyway, he said. The timing wasn't great, but it wasn't the worst thing that had happened to him in 1993 either. Norma Jean thanked him and hung up and sat for a while at the kitchen table with her coffee going cold in front of her. She understood what the call meant. A Matthews Tower dryer without a parts supply was a counting-down piece of equipment. Bearings she could source generically. Orgs or flights she could have fabricated. But the recirculating heat exchanger used a proprietary manifold casting that Matthews had machined in-house in Danville, and the burner assembly used a combustion chamber liner that was specific to the Matthews design. When those components failed, she would need to either find them in existing inventory somewhere or convert the dryer to a different burner system entirely, which would require an engineering change she wasn't certain she could execute alone. She did not panic. She made a list. Over the following 3 weeks, she called every Matthews distributor she could locate in a 6-state area and bought out their remaining inventory of heat exchanger manifolds, combustion chamber liners, and critical bearings. She spent $4,200. She stored the parts in labeled bins on the shelf above the gray filing cabinet. She updated her parts inventory in a new folder she labeled Math EWS Contingency in red marker. Then she drove past the Midland Ag Systems lot on a Wednesday afternoon and slowed down and looked at the dryers behind the chain-link fence for a long time. She had seen old Matthews units in that lot before. She was fairly certain there were 2 of them, possibly 3, in varying states of intact. If they were there, they were part sources, heat exchanger manifolds, combustion chamber liners, components that no longer existed in any distributor's catalog, but that might still exist on machines that Terry Voss had never gotten around to scrapping. She did not stop that day. She went home and thought about it for 2 days, which was how long it took her to decide that the conversation with Terry Voss was going to be unpleasant, and that unpleasant conversations were not improved by delay. She called him on Friday afternoon. She told him she had driven past his lot and she thought she had seen some Matthews Tower dryers in there. She told him Matthews had discontinued the product line and that the part supply was drying up. She told him she thought she could use whatever Matthews units he had back there, or parts off them, and that she'd be willing to haul them off his lot and clean up the space. The silence on the other end lasted about 3 seconds. Then Terry Boss said he'd have to see what he had back there, and whether any of it was worth anything to him as parts or trade. Norma Jean said she didn't think a discontinued product line from a company that had just been absorbed by a conglomerate was going to appreciate in value for him. Terry said he'd have to think about it. She said she'd call back Monday. She called back Monday. Terry said he'd thought about it, and he had 4 Matthews units back there, and he didn't want to just give them away, but he'd take $500 for all 4 as-is U-Haul. She said she'd be there Thursday with a trailer. Terry said make it Friday. He had a sales day Thursday with the GSI regional rep. She was there Friday at 7 in the morning with Cal driving the flatbed and her neighbor's son, a 22-year-old named Derek Paulson, who was strong and didn't ask unnecessary questions. By noon, they had all 4 units loaded and chained. Terry Voss came out of his office once and watched them for a few minutes and went back inside without saying anything useful. Let me tell you about what Norma Jean found when she got the machines into her shed, because what she found was the reason she spent the next 4 years doing what she did. 2 of the 4 units were genuinely stripped. Someone had pulled the burner assemblies from both of them years earlier, probably to service other machines, and the heat exchanger manifolds had been removed as well. The column structures were intact and the auger housings were usable, but as complete dryers they were beyond practical restoration. The other 2 were different. One of them had a burned control panel and a seized auger drive shaft, damage that looked like a single wet harvest season that had pushed too much high-moisture corn through the system too fast and overloaded both the electrical and mechanical components at once. The heat exchanger was intact. The combustion chamber liner was intact. The burner assembly was intact, and when Norma Jean disassembled it in her shed, she found the combustion chamber liner in nearly perfect condition. Whoever had owned this machine had maintained the burner side of it carefully while apparently running the auger and electrical systems into the ground. The 4th unit was the one she had not expected. It was a 1978 Matthews, same generation as her own, and it had been sitting in Terry's lot since approximately 1987 based on the residue pattern on the legs and the condition of the exterior paint. It had a cracked column section on the upper third of the tower, which was repairable, and a missing access panel on the heat exchanger housing, which was cosmetic. Every critical component was present and in serviceable condition. The heat exchanger manifold was in better shape than the one on her own dryer. The combustion chamber liner was essentially new. The burner assembly needed a fuel valve and a thermocouple, both of which she had in her contingency bins. She stood in her shed that first evening after Cal had gone inside for supper, and she looked at those 4 machines for a long time. She had not gone to Terry Voss's lot looking to rebuild dryers. She had gone looking for parts. But what she had found was something closer to an opportunity, and Norma Jean Schaefer had her father Bernard's habit of recognizing when something in front of her had more value than the person who owned it had understood. She called Harold Finney in Des Moines, who was 2 months from retirement, and answered his phone with the careful patience of a man counting down days. She told him what she had found. He listened without rushing her. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said he thought she was right about the 4th unit, and probably right about the 3rd, and that if she could get the auger drive on the 3rd one sorted out, she'd have 2 functional dryers sitting in her shed, and enough spare parts from the strip units to keep all 3 of her Matthews dryers running for another 20 years if she was careful. He said Matthews had never built a bad machine. He said the problem was that Matthews had never been very good at being a company, just at being engineers, and there was a difference. Norma Jean said she knew the difference. She spent the winter of 1993 and the spring of 1994 working on the machines. She rebuilt the auger drive on the 3rd unit using a replacement gearbox she sourced from a general agricultural parts supplier in Ames, a standard ratio that matched the Matthews specification. She rewired the control panel with components from an electrical supply house in Fort Dodge. She replaced the cracked column section on the fourth unit with a steel fabrication she had made at a shop in Rockwell City run by a welder named Pete Garber, who had been doing custom agricultural fabrication for 30 years and who looked at her drawings for about 90 seconds before saying he could have it done in a week. She was not rebuilding those dryers to sell. She was rebuilding them because she understood what they were and because she could not watch a functional machine become a parts carcass when the situation didn't require it. She put service records on both units in the gray filing cabinet. She tested them both that fall with her own corn and recorded the moisture out numbers against the propane consumption figures. The fourth unit, the 1978 machine with the nearly new heat exchanger, outperformed her own dryer on fuel efficiency by 11%. She wrote that number down and circled it. She had spent approximately $30,100 on parts, fabrication, and materials for both units. A new GSI dryer of comparable capacity from Midland Ag Systems cost $18,500 installed. She did not tell Terry Voss. Let me tell you about what was happening at Midland Ag Systems during those same years, because the story runs on two tracks, and they were always going to cross. Terry Voss had continued selling GSI dryers to the 1990s. The GSI units were competent machines. They were not deficient in any way that a buyer could point to and complain about. But the GSI tower dryer of that era used a single-pass heat design that exhausted burner gases directly, rather than recirculating them. And the propane consumption numbers on a per-bushel basis were measurably higher than the Matthews recirculating design. In 1991, when propane was running at 47 cents a gallon, this was a difference that most farmers noticed on their fuel bills and attributed to harvest conditions or corn moisture and moved on. By 1996, when propane had climbed to 68 cents, and by 2000, when it pushed past 80, it was a difference that was harder to explain away. Terry Voss explained it away anyway. He was good at that. What Terry was less good at was the transition that the grain industry was making in the late 1990s toward precision moisture management. The big commercial elevators were starting to require tighter moisture tolerances on delivered grain. The old practice of running corn down to 13 or 14% and calling it done was giving way to a market that paid premiums for consistent 14.5 and docked hard for anything over 15.5. The GSI dryers that Terry had sold across Calhoun County for 15 years were batch and column machines that were not well suited to the precision endpoint control the new market was rewarding. They dried efficiently enough in a broad range, but hitting a specific target moisture consistently required the kind of heat recovery and flow rate control that the Matthews recirculating design had built in from the beginning. Farmers were starting to notice, not all of them, not loudly, but at the co-op and at the elevator and at the coffee counter at the Farm Bureau office in Rockwell City, the conversations about drying costs and moisture consistency were getting longer and less comfortable for Terry Voss and the GSI line he had built his business on. In the fall of 2001, a farmer named Gary Bierman, who ran 640 acres 4 miles east of the Schaefer place, had a bad drying season. His GSI unit was 8 years old and running well mechanically, but he had delivered 4 loads to the elevator in October that came back over moisture and cost him $1,400 in dockage. He had run the numbers with his wife over the winter and concluded that his drying operation was costing him more than it should, and that he needed a different approach. Gary Bierman called Norma Jean Schaefer in February because his wife had gone to high school with Cal's sister, and because he had heard the way things were heard in Calhoun County, that Norma Jean had some dryers in her shed that ran differently than what Terry Voss was selling. Norma Jean invited him over on a Saturday morning. She showed him both rebuilt units in the shed. She showed him the service records. She showed him the fuel consumption logs from the 3 harvest seasons she had run the 1978 unit, the moisture out readings compared against the propane figures, and the comparison against her own original dryer's performance numbers. She showed him the elevator receipts from her own deliveries that showed her moisture consistency over the same period. She told him the unit would cost him $2,400 installed and she would install it herself, because she had the equipment and the knowledge and she had done it twice before on her own farm. She told him that if anything failed in the first 2 years, she would fix it at her cost. She told him that the recirculating heat design would cut his per bushel drying cost by somewhere between 15 and 22% based on what she had seen on her own operation, and that his moisture consistency at the elevator would improve because the endpoint control was better in the Matthews design. Gary Byerman sat at her kitchen table and looked at the fuel consumption numbers for a long time. Then he said yes. She installed the dryer in July of 2002. That fall, he delivered his corn to the elevator and came back with moisture numbers inside half a point of his target on every load. His drying fuel cost for the season was 19% lower than the previous year on comparable bushels. He called Norma Jean in November and read her the numbers. She wrote them in the service folder she had started for his unit. Word moves in a small county the way a dry fall moves across a cornfield. You don't see it coming until it's already everywhere. By the spring of 2003, Norma Jean had installed the second rebuilt unit for a farmer named Sandra Hoekstra, who ran 400 acres southwest of Pomeroy and had been fighting inconsistent moisture readings for 3 seasons. By the fall of 2003, she had 2 neighbors on a waiting list asking if she knew of any other Matthews units that could be rebuilt, which she didn't, but she had started looking. Let me tell you about what Terry Voss heard, because he heard it the way that men who have held the same market for 20 years hear things that threaten it. All at once, from several directions, each piece arriving with a specific weight of information that someone else thinks you already know. He drove out to the Schaefer farm on a Thursday afternoon in April of 2004. He did not call first. He pulled his pickup into the yard and Norma Jean was coming out of the machine shed with a clipboard and a grease mark on her left forearm, and she looked at him the way she looked at equipment she was assessing, which was without particular feeling in either direction. Terry stood by his truck and said he had been hearing things. Norma Jean said she expected he had. He asked if she was selling dryers. She said she was not selling dryers. She was rebuilding Matthews units that would otherwise be scrapped and installing them for neighbors at her cost of parts and labor. Terry said that was the same as selling dryers. Norma Jean said it was not the same thing and he knew it. There was a silence. A truck went by on the county road. Terry looked at the machine shed. He asked if he could see what she had. She opened the shed and let him in. There was one remaining unit inside, a machine she had sourced from a farm sale in Webster County the previous spring, a 1981 Matthews in better condition than anything she had bought from Terry's lot. It was on blocks, stripped down to the heat exchanger housing and the column structure, and the parts she had removed were laid out on a workbench along the east wall, with each component tagged and numbered, and a folder on the bench beside them with the disassembly record. Terry walked around it slowly. He looked at the tagged components on the bench. He looked at the folder. He picked it up and opened it, and looked at the disassembly records and Norma Jean's careful handwriting, the component dimensions and wear measurements and condition notes. He set it down. He looked at the heat exchanger manifold on the bench for a moment. Then he said, "Those parts don't exist anymore. Matthews is gone." Norma Jean said, "I know. That's why I have them." Another silence. Terry said, "You're creating expectations you won't be able to meet. What happens when you run out of parts? What happens when one of these fails and you can't fix it?" Norma Jean said she had a 12-year parts inventory for the critical components and that she sourced generic replacements for everything else. She said she had documentation on every unit she had installed and that her failure rate was 0. Terry said, "0 so far." Norma Jean said, "0 so far." Terry picked up his jacket from where he had set it on the workbench and said she needed to understand that she was taking on liability that she might not fully appreciate. Norma Jean said she had spoken with her insurance agent and her attorney and she understood her position. Terry went to his truck. He sat there for a moment with the engine running. Then he rolled down the window and said, "I hope you know what you're doing, Norma." She said, "I usually do." He rolled the window up and pulled out of the yard. Now let me ask you something. Have you ever watched a person drive away from a conversation where they just learned that the thing they dismissed as worthless had been running successfully for a decade, and try to imagine what they were thinking on that drive back? Because Terry Voss drove back to Rockwell City that afternoon, knowing that the machines he had let sit in his lot for 15 years, the machines he had never gotten around to scrapping because scrapping required initiative, had been rebuilt into working dryers by a woman with a welder's daughter's education and a gray filing cabinet and a telephone relationship with a retired parts distributor in Des Moines. He drove back knowing that 2 of his former customers were running those dryers. He drove back knowing that their fuel bills were lower and their elevator receipts were better, and that word was spreading. He drove back knowing that Norma Jean Schaefer had called him in 1993, and he had made her pay $500 for 4 machines he had no use for and never thought about again. That is a specific kind of knowledge. It does not get easier with distance. Let me tell you about the years that followed, because the story does not end in that machine shed. Midland Ag Systems closed in the summer of 2008. It was not sudden. It was the slow kind of closing, the kind where the service contracts drift to other providers and the inventory ages and the bank conversations become exercises in managed disappointment. Terry Voss had been fighting the margin compression for 4 years. The GSI line had introduced a new tower dryer model in 2005 with improved heat recovery numbers, which Terry had been slow to stock because the transition required retiring his existing inventory at a loss he wasn't ready to take. He had lost 2 major commercial accounts to a competitor out of Storm Lake who was offering the new design with better financing terms. By 2007, Midland was a 3-employee shop in a building that had been sized for 9. Terry Voss called his remaining employees into the shop on a Tuesday morning in June of 2008 and told them he was closing at the end of the month. He paid them through August. He sold the building and the remaining lot inventory to the Storm Lake operation and moved to a house in Lake City where he kept a boat on Black Hawk Lake and did not talk about grain dryers. Norma Jean heard about it from Gary Bierman, who had heard about it at the elevator. She was 69 years old by then and had been farming the Schaefer ground for 40 years. She had installed 4 rebuilt Matthews dryers for neighbors in the preceding 6 years. She had 1 unit remaining in her shed, the 1981 Webster County machine she had been finishing when Terry Voss had stood in her shed and asked what she was doing. Not one of the 4 installations had required a service callback. Her daughter, Ruth Schaefer, had come back to the farm in 2005 after 11 years working as an industrial systems technician for a food processing plant in Waterloo. Ruth was 38 years old and had her grandmother's precision and her mother's patience and an education in industrial electrical systems and pneumatic controls that was, if anything, more complete than what Norma Jean had assembled through decades of self-directed learning. She had been helping with the dryer restoration since she came back. She knew every unit her mother had built and every service record in the gray filing cabinet, and she had opinions about the heat exchanger efficiency that Norma Jean found worth listening to. When Cal's health began to decline in 2010 and the farming operation began its gradual transition to Ruth's management, the machine shed and its contents and the filing cabinet and the institutional knowledge that lived in Norma Jean's head passed incrementally to her daughter. Ruth had her mother's habit of writing things down, and her grandfather Bernard's habit of listening to what a machine was telling you before deciding what to do with it. Let me tell you about what Ruth Schaefer did with what her mother had built, because this is the part of the story that explains why I am telling it to you now. In the spring of 2013, Ruth drove to a farm liquidation auction in Pocahontas County and came home with 2 more Matthews Tower dryers loaded on a flatbed trailer. She had paid $800 for both. She had spotted them in the auction listing 3 weeks earlier, identified the models from a photograph, and driven out to inspect them before the sale. One was a 1983 unit in fair condition. The other was a 1979, same generation as her mother's original, and when Ruth pulled the access panel on the heat exchanger, she found a manifold casting in better condition than anything currently running on the Schaefer farm. She called her mother from the parking lot of the auction. Norma Jean asked about the manifold condition. Ruth described it. Norma Jean was quiet for a moment, then she said, "That's a better one than I've got." Ruth said, "I know." Norma Jean said, "Don't pay more than $1,000 for both of them." Ruth said, "I paid $800. Norma Jean said, "Good." She rebuilt both units over the winter of 2013 and the spring of 2014, working in the evenings after the day's farm work was done, in the same shed, at the same workbench, under the same lights her mother had strung along the ceiling joists in 1994. She added the service records to the gray filing cabinet in new folders she labeled in her own handwriting. She updated the parts inventory list that her mother had started with the components she had pulled from the stripped sections of the two auction units. In the fall of 2015, the farmer named Don Recker, who ran 560 acres north of Lorville, had a drying season that cost him more than he could explain satisfactorily to his wife or his banker. His GSI dryer was 12 years old and mechanically sound, but his fuel consumption numbers were high and his elevator moisture consistency had been marginal for 3 straight years. He had talked to the Storm Lake operation about a new dryer and received a quote of $24,000 installed that he did not have room for in his operation's finances. Don Recker called Ruth Schaefer because his daughter was in the same FFA chapter as Ruth's son, and because he had heard about the dryers at a meeting of the County Farm Bureau that fall. Ruth showed him the shed. She showed him both rebuilt units. She showed him her mother's original service records going back to 1994, and her own records from the machine she had installed since 2013. She showed him the fuel consumption comparisons. She showed him 4 years of Gary Bierman's elevator receipts, which Gary had been sending her each fall because he thought they were useful data, and because he was that kind of neighbor. She told him the unit would cost $2,800 installed, same terms her mother had always used. Don Recker looked at the filing cabinet, which was sitting open with the folders visible, and then he looked at the unit on its pallet, and then he said, "Your mother started this." Ruth said she had. He said, "How long ago?" Ruth said, 1993, 22 years. He said he'd take the dryer. Ruth installed it in June of 2016. The following fall, Don Recker delivered his corn to the elevator, and his moisture numbers were inside 1 point of target on every load. He called Ruth in November. She added a page to his service folder with the installation measurements and the first season's performance data, the same way her mother had always done it. Let me tell you one last thing about Norma Jean Schaefer, because she deserves it. Norma Jean died in January of 2019 at the age of 79. She had farmed the Schaefer ground for 48 years. She had maintained her own dryers without a single service call to any outside contractor for the entirety of that time. Her original Matthews dryer, the one Cal's father Eldon had bought in 1971, with the fuel savings numbers penciled in the margin of his ledger, was still running when she died. She had replaced the heat exchanger manifold once, in 2006, with one of the units she had sourced from Terry Voss's lot. She had replaced the combustion chamber liner twice. She had replaced bearings and auger flights on a scheduled basis and documented every service in the gray filing cabinet. The last entry in her service folder for that dryer was dated September of 2018, 4 months before she died. She had pulled the burner assembly for its scheduled inspection, cleaned the combustion chamber, checked the thermocouple calibration against a reference thermometer she had owned since 1989, and reinstalled everything. The thermocouple reading was within 3 degrees of the reference. She had noted this in the folder in her careful handwriting and added a line at the bottom. Manifold flow rates unchanged from 2014 inspection. Design continues to perform as specified. Her funeral was at St. John's Lutheran in Rockwell City. There were 160 people there, which in Calhoun County means you were known and known well. Gary Bierman was there. Sandra Hoekstra was there. Don Recker was there. Ruth sat in the front pew with her husband and her 2 children, a son named Marcus who was 24 and farming full-time alongside her. and a daughter named Claire who was 20 and in her second year of agricultural engineering at Iowa State, and who had her great-grandmother's habit of asking why something worked before she accepted that it did. Terry Voss was not there. He had died in 2016. His obituary in the Rockwell City paper had mentioned his years running Midland Ag Systems and his love of fishing on Black Hawk Lake. It had not mentioned the dryers in the lot behind his building or the woman who had paid him $500 for 4 of them on a Friday morning in October of 1993. Ruth had read the obituary. She had not said anything about it to anyone in particular. There was nothing useful to say. Let me tell you about the spring of 2021, because that is when the circle completed. Claire Musselman had come home from Iowa State in 2020 with a degree in agricultural engineering and a senior thesis project on variable rate drying systems that her faculty advisor had described in his letter of recommendation as the most practically grounded undergraduate research he had supervised in 14 years. She had written the thesis about her grandmother's dryers. She had used Norma Jean service records, 26 years of fuel consumption data, and moisture output numbers as the empirical foundation. Her advisor had asked her twice to verify the data set because the consistency of the numbers across that span was unusual. Claire had told him her grandmother had kept very good records. He had said that was an understatement. Claire came home wanting to retrofit the remaining Schaefer dryers, all 4 of them now running on the home farm, with adaptive airflow controls that would modulate the drying temperature in real time based on continuous grain moisture sampling at the column outlet. The system she had designed as her thesis project would, she estimated, reduce propane consumption by an additional 18 to 24% and improve moisture consistency at the elevator to within a quarter point of target. The retrofit cost per unit would be approximately $1,600 in sensors and control hardware. Ruth listened to all of it at the kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon in April. She looked at the diagrams Claire had drawn. She looked at the data from the thesis. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your grandmother bought the first of these dryers out of a lot full of things nobody wanted for $500 total." Claire said she knew. Ruth said, "Do all 4. The 4 Matthews dryers on the Schaefer farm are running today with Claire's adaptive airflow systems installed. They are running on machines that Norma Jean Schaefer rebuilt between 1993 and 1996, using components that Terry Voss had left sitting in a gravel lot because he had not gotten around to deciding what to do with them. The adaptive controls are reading grain moisture samples 18 times per hour and adjusting the burner output accordingly. The propane consumption for the 2022 harvest season was 22% below the pre-retrofit baseline. The moisture numbers at the elevator were within a quarter point of target on 94% of deliveries. The service records are in the gray filing cabinet, updated in Ruth's handwriting and increasingly in Claire's. The cabinet is the same one Norma Jean bought at the office supply store in Fort Dodge in 1968. The drawer pulls have been replaced twice. One corner was dented in 1999 when a combine header was moved too fast through the shed. There is a strip of electrical tape along the bottom edge where the paint worn through to bare metal. Ruth has been asked more than once why she doesn't just scan the records and store them digitally. She says she will get to it. She has been saying that for several years. Claire has been keeping parallel digital records since 2021 without making an announcement about it. This is exactly the kind of thing her grandmother would have done. There is a photograph taped to the inside of the machine shed door. It was taken by Cal Schaefer in the fall of 1994, the first harvest season after Norma Jean had the 2 rebuilt units running. It shows Norma Jean standing at the workbench along the east wall of the shed with one of the heat exchanger manifolds in her hands, holding it up to the light from the door, examining the casting surface. She is wearing her work jacket and her father's seed cap from the years when Bernard Kowalczyk was still alive and still brought motors home on Friday evenings. Her hands are clean, which means she is looking at a component she has just finished cleaning, not one she is about to disassemble. Her expression is the expression of someone who has just confirmed that a thing is exactly as good as she thought it was. She is not looking at the camera. Ruth walks past that photograph every morning when she goes into the shed. She has never moved it from where Cal taped it in 1995. It will be on that door for as long as Ruth Schaefer is walking into that shed in the morning, which she intends to be for a very long time. Terry Voss had 9 years of retirement in Lake City and caught a lot of fish and grew a garden that his neighbors said was exceptional. He never came back to Rockwell City as far as anyone knows. He never drove out to the Schaefer farm after that afternoon in April of 2004 when he stood in the shed and picked up the disassembly folder and set it back down and said the parts didn't exist anymore. Norma Jean had not held it against him. Ruth doesn't either. The dryers do not require Terry Voss to have been right. They only required Norma Jean Schaefer to have been paying attention and to have understood, in the way that her father Bernard had understood standing at his basement bench in Sioux Falls with a burned motor and a meter and a Friday evening ahead of him, that something is not finished just because someone with a lot behind a chain-link fence decided it wasn't worth their time. 4 dryers went into that lot as problems nobody wanted to solve. 2 of them came out as something better than what the county had been buying for 20 years. They're still running. The woman who rebuilt them is gone, but the records are in the cabinet, and the cabinet is in the shed. And in the shed there is a 20-year-old with her great-grandmother's habits and 4 dryers that have not yet told her everything they know. I keep thinking about the moment Norma Jean sat at her kitchen table with her coffee going cold, after Harold Finney called to tell her that Matthews was gone and the parts supply was drying up. Most people in that situation would have called Terry Voss for a quote on a new dryer. That would have been the reasonable thing, the expected thing. Instead, she made a list. That list is what I come back to. Not the rebuild dryers, not the fuel savings numbers, not the service records in that gray filing cabinet. The list, because making a list when the world is telling you the situation is over requires something that most people talk about, but fewer people actually practice. It requires the quiet belief that your own careful attention is worth something, that what you know, built slowly over years at your father's basement bench and through 2 decades of farm work, is a real asset and not just a personal habit. Norma Jean had that belief. She didn't announce it. She didn't argue for it. She just acted on it, which is the only version of that belief that counts for anything. I think about Terry Voss, too. He wasn't a bad man. The story doesn't work if he's a villain, and he wasn't one. He was a man who had built something real over 20 years, and who had stopped learning somewhere in the middle of it. He had a lot full of machines he didn't understand well enough to value, and when Norma Jean called him, he took $500 and thought he'd gotten the better end of the deal. He probably believed that right up until the afternoon, he stood in her shed and read her disassembly records, maybe longer. What separates those 2 people is not talent or luck or even hard work in the simple physical sense. It's the difference between someone who keeps records because they genuinely want to understand what they're depending on, and someone who stops asking questions once the business is running well enough. One of those people builds something that outlasts them. The other one eventually runs out of road. Ruth understood this without being told. She came back to the farm after 11 years away, and she didn't try to replace what her mother had built with something newer or more modern. She sat down with the gray filing cabinet and learned it first. That kind of intellectual honesty, the willingness to start with what actually exists before deciding what needs to change, is rarer than any technical skill. Claire has it too. She wrote her senior thesis on her grandmother's dryers using 26 years of handwritten fuel logs as her data set. Her faculty advisor thought the consistency of those numbers was unusual. I don't think it was unusual at all. I think it was the natural result of one woman paying careful attention for a very long time. The machine that Norma Jean kept running the longest was the one Eldon Schaefer had bought in 1971, based on penciled calculations in the margin of a ledger. 3 generations of people making decisions the same way, slowly on the basis of evidence, without much concern for what the man at the counter thought about it. I don't know what happened on Terry Voss's drive back to Rockwell City that April afternoon in 2004. I don't know if he sat with what he had seen or whether he put it away and moved on. What I know is that the filing cabinet is still in the shed, And Ruth walks past that photograph every morning, and Claire's digital records are built in alongside the paper ones, and the dryers are still running. There's a version of this story where Norma Jean confronts Terry, where she gets credit publicly, where someone writes it up in the Farm Bureau newsletter. That version didn't happen. This version happened instead. A woman with her father's habits and her own hard-earned knowledge did her work carefully for decades, passed what she knew to her daughter, and left the world with 4 dryers running better than the day she found them. That's enough. It was always enough.